I suppose I want to start with somewhere where Omar started, which he talked about the unbearable grief, and just that phrase really just resonated because I think it describes it well. And although Omar didn't stay in the unbearable grief, he got to a rallying cry that I thought was very powerful. I think it's important to acknowledge how we're all feeling, to acknowledge what's going on, and to acknowledge that in history, people will say, what did you do? Where did you stand? And sometimes being in Westminster Hall on a Saturday morning can feel not enough. And I don't think it's enough, but what we're doing today is continuing to grow the movement, to organise, to listen, to reflect. And for us all to take responsibility about how this room is pretty busy, but how do we make sure in the future the room is even busy? When we have actions, how are we going to grow these actions? How can we talk to our friends, our neighbours, our colleagues? Talk about the greatest moral litmus test of our time. And for all those people who are being silent right now, who know that it's not acceptable, but either feel paralysed with fear to speak out for fear of being smeared, or don't speak out because they just think, what difference would my voice do? The power that we each have individually in this room to acknowledge the agency and choices we have in this country and variously around the world, to speak out on the genocide, to call a genocide what it is. And actually one of the most powerful speakers I've heard speak on this was at a PSC rally where I was also speaking. Now, let me acknowledge I've heard other politicians give amazing speeches, I've heard movement leaders give amazing speeches, but actually this speech for me was an unexpected place. It was a pop star, it was Paloma Faith. And Paloma Faith got up there, and her speech has really stuck with me, and you can find it on the internet, so I won't repeat her whole speech now, but I will paraphrase a minute of it, because I think it's something we should all carry with us. She just took to the stage, and in front of thousands of people, she said, people have told me by speaking out, by being at this microphone, I might lose sales, I might lose business, I might damage my reputation. But you know what? There's a genocide happening in Palestine, and innocent children are dying. And people will say to me, do you really understand politics? You know, it's quite complicated, geopolitical stuff. Should you be interfering? And she just looks at them and says, there's a genocide happening in Palestine, and children are dying. And other people would try to find ways to distract her, to not talk about this, and she will always return to the fact that children are dying. And so when we think about why are we in this hall, it's not just for children who are dying, it's people who are dying. It's people who are dying at a time when we're in this hall, a hall steeped in history, that has long rallied for dignity, for justice, to ask the world to not look away. But we know far too much of the world right now is looking away. And although every time we turn on our phone screens or we look on the TV, we hear the screams, we hear the cries of dying people, of innocent people whose lives are being massacred, of a country that is being destroyed, of a genocide, of ethnic cleansing, and a war crime that is not just happening with our government's complicity, but our government's active participation. We are selling those arms to Israel. We are sharing intelligence with Israel. And when Israel started an illegal war with Iran, cheered and backed on by Donald Trump and America, Keir Starmer was not out there front and centre, condemning what was a breach of international law, despite being a human rights lawyer for much of his career. He was giving implicit, coded nods that this was all fine, that Iran at some point was some kind of extreme threat, despite the fact that Tony Brennan, the former head of the CIA, hardly a friend of the anti-war movement, said that Iran is nowhere near nuclear weapons and is no imminent threat to anyone. So this is both the global context and the national context we are in this country right now, where we see national politicians, particularly from the two old parties, shrug their shoulders, say, of course we want an end to war, of course we want a ceasefire, but continue to sell arms. If this wasn't so disastrous, so catastrophic and so destructive, it would be laughable, because it's so incoherent in its thinking that it doesn't even require a moment to think about it. For the full mask to lift off of our country's complicity with these crimes, not just since October 7th and the increasing onslaught, but decades, going back to the Balfour Declaration and the colonialism, neo-colonialism of our attitude towards Israel and the way we've treated this apartheid state. So, what do we do about it? I really recall a moment about a year ago. I was on LBC in a debate. I was debating, I almost don't want to say her name because I don't want to make her more famous, but Annabel Benham, who is the deputy political editor of the Daily Telegraph. And we had a fairly kind of rambunctious debate about lots of things, but then we got onto the issue of Palestine. And she said that the Palestine marches, the marches for the reason so many people have been marching on with thousands, tens of thousands of people who have been marching in peace, calling for anti-war, calling for a peace movement. She described these marches as hate marches. And she said that you can't say this without being called racist. I interrupted and said that's because it's a racist thing to say. She then said, next you'll be calling me a bigot. I shrugged my shoulders and said, if you say bigoted things. And the host, rather than being offended by the racism going on in his show, asked me to apologise. Or to leave. And as I left, I made the point that I have this microphone and I have a responsibility to speak up about what I see. And while telling this story, I always want to centre the lives of the Palestinians. And I always want to centre speeches that we just heard. I do think it's important, though, without centering it, to note that I am Jewish. I come from a background where I went to a Jewish school. I was raised with a Jewish education. But I don't oppose this genocide in spite of my Jewishness. I oppose this genocide because of my Jewishness. When I grew up and I learned the history of the Holocaust, when I learned about genocide, I learned that never again was not just for one person or one group of people. When we say never again, that is for everybody and must remain so. And so finally, I want to come to the question that I posed, what can we do about this? Now this will sound odd, I'm an elected politician. Right now, I'm running to be leader of the Green Party, but I also know that the change will not come from elected politicians. The change will not solely come from leaders of parties and movements. The change will come from grassroots movements, from people power, because that's the only thing that's ever changed anything. From the suffragettes, from the civil rights movement, from the anti-apartheid movement. The change never came from the leaders of movements or people giving great speeches, although that certainly helped. The change came from the behaviour of people, from the behaviour of communities, from people's choices. Now, this is counterintuitive to me. I was just having this conversation with Rivka, I don't know where she's gone. And for a long time as a climate activist, and I still stick by this, people often try to stick with you, are you vegan, do you drive, do you fly? And by the way, I am vegan, I don't drive and I don't fly. But that is not the point. They're only asking those questions because they want to shout hypocrite at you. I've long said that you can be an environmentalist and you can be a climate justice activist and do all of these things if you don't have the privilege to do anything else. These kind of purity tests are just ways of dividing us. And ultimately, the idea that you have to be perfect in your behaviour is another barrier that people can create. However, at the same time, if you do have the choice, if you do have the power and the privilege to be able to make your decisions, then why wouldn't you use your consumer power? Why wouldn't you make it really clear to those organisations and those corporates who are benefiting, who are profiting from war crimes and a genocide, that you would not dream of buying their products? And make sure that the local neighbourhood and the shop that you go in, make sure that it is clear that that is an anti-apartheid zone. And encourage them. I was just hearing about the amazing work happening in Bristol, where there are whole areas where neighbourhood shops are saying very clearly, this genocide is not on me. This is the power we all have. And one thing I will say on this is it is working. I was in a media organisation just yesterday, a pretty right-wing one, where I went to do an interview. They offered me a drink. I said, could I have a soft drink? They said, do you want Coke? And then they caught themselves and said, of course you won't be drinking Coke, will you? Now, the next step, and I'm not obviously, the next step is to stop them offering and supplying the Coke at all. But the fact this message is even resonating does matter. And I know sometimes these things can feel so atomized. We can go, what difference does it make what I buy or what goes on in my house? But it really does make a difference. Because these economic paths, which are effectively economic sanctions against the company, do add up. I wish that these companies cared about the people and the planet, and some companies do, but the majority of these companies are there for one thing: they're there for profit. So let's hit them with the profits. Let's make sure that if they won't stand for people and planet, if they won't stand for innocent people, if they won't stand for peace, we will make them stand for the right things. We will engage with the system in the way that we know how to change it. So, to wrap up, thank you so much for being here. There is so much power in this movement. There is so much momentum in this movement. I know when I go knocking on doors, I'm off to Stafford just straight after this plenary. And I know when I speak to people, they will actively bring up Palestine. Don't let the media pretend that this is some kind of niche thing or only people who carry placards or protest care about it. And by the way, solidarity to everyone who is carrying a placard, everyone who is protesting, and indeed everyone who is taking action on Palestine deserves our solidarity. Protesting is one way of changing things, but the power of dialogue, the power of boycott, the power of divestment, and the power of sanctions. And the only obvious place to end is to say sometimes things can seem impossible until they are done. And that's how we'll change our towns. It's how we'll change the country. And it is how together we can change the world. Solidarity. Thank you.